Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Mary Midgley and her little essay, Trying Out One's New Sword. This is one of my favorite philosophical essays. It has all of the virtues of a great philosophical essay. It is lucid, it is easy to read, and it is short. Those are all of the virtues of a good philosophical essay. So yeah, it won't take you very long to read. Hopefully you've already read it. And so I'm not going to do a play-by-play of this essay because if you've read it, then you will understand it's pretty clear. We're just going to hit some of the highlights and make sure that everybody is, in fact, clear about the big points of the essay. So first, let's talk a little bit about Mary Midgley, the person, the philosopher. So Mary Midgley, she was born in 1919, and she lived until 2018. So she lived a very long life. She studied at Oxford University. She's one of a number of extraordinary female philosophers, such as Anscombe and Philippa Foot and others who were at Oxford around World War II. And she went to be a professor at Newcastle University in the UK. Recently, there's been, I think, 2 books written about this cohort of female philosophers that moved through Oxford and Cambridge and places like this during the Second World War. So worth looking at. Very influential philosophers. I have a great deal of affection for Mary Midgley. She used to like to wear these really big hats. So if you look up pictures of her, she's always wearing a big hat, which I think is fun. She has written a number of really important works, including Beast and Man, Animals and Why They Matter, Evolution as a Religion, and Science as Salvation. One of the reasons I like her, other than the fact that I think she seemed to be a person of good humor and intelligence and good wit, but she liked to tussle with people. So she, in the last years of her life, was in the news for picking a fight with the world famous atheist and biologist Richard Dawkins. I just think that she was just a really interesting person and a wonderful philosopher. And one of the reasons that I like her and the way that I was introduced to her was actually through this essay, and it's had an enormous impact on my life. And in fact, I've even titled a concept that I've developed in my own professional career based on this essay. So it's kind of an homage to her. In any case, so let's talk about this essay. So Trying Out One's New Sword. In this essay, Trying Out One's New Sword, Mary Midgley introduces this term that she calls moral isolationism. So the first thing to get clear about this essay is that Mary Midgley is not endorsing moral isolationism. So hopefully you all got this just from reading it. She is not endorsing it. In fact, she disagrees with moral isolationism. If you're not familiar with philosophical writing, which many of you are not, you're just now becoming familiar with philosophical writing. But if you're not familiar with it, this may seem strange to you, but this is the way the philosophers often work, is they will pinpoint something, label it, create a concept, label the thing that they're going to talk about, and then they'll critique it. So this is one of the things that philosophers will do is they'll write entire essays, entire books, just critiquing an idea, just criticizing an idea, not endorsing it, not saying here's what I think, we should be believing about X, Y, and Z. They'll say, look, I'm witnessing this. Other people are talking about this, or people are, doing X, Y, and Z, and I think that that's wrong because, right? And so they don't necessarily have a positive account, something that they're saying we should be doing instead, but they're saying we shouldn't be doing this other thing. And that's kind of what Midgley is doing here with moral isolationism. She's essentially noting a phenomenon, and she is, going to try to pin it down and label it so that we can think clearly about it, and then she's going to go on and say and to critique it and say that this way of thinking is actually mistaken, and that's what she's doing in this essay. So what is moral isolationism? Moral isolationism, I'm going to try to do my shortened version of this, and again, it should be on the study guide. Moral isolationism is essentially the idea that if you're not from a culture, if you're not from a culture, if you're not a member of that culture, if you're not from a culture, then you cannot understand that culture, and you cannot make judgments about that culture. Okay? So if you're not from a culture, then you cannot understand that culture, and you cannot make judgments about that culture. All right? So a couple of things to get clear about. First of all, Midgley is not saying that if you're not from a culture, you don't understand it. That may or may not be true, right? And it certainly is the case, and she would say that this is the case, that if you don't understand the culture, you shouldn't be making judgments, you shouldn't be passing judgments on that culture if you don't, as a matter of fact, understand it. What you should do is inform yourself before you make judgments about another culture. But that's not what moral isolationism is. Moral isolationism is not the idea that if you're not from a culture, you just, as a matter of fact, don't understand it. Moral isolationism is the claim that if you're not from a culture, you cannot understand it. Right? It's like not a matter of research or something. It's like you're not from there, you're just never going to get it. That's the idea. And so it's kind of like a hands-off attitude with regard to other cultures. If you're not from there, you can never understand it. It doesn't even matter if you go and live there. Like, you're never really going to be a member of that culture. You can't understand it. You're always going to be like an outsider. And so therefore you can never pass judgment on these other cultures. And Midgley is going to say that that view is mistaken. Okay? Second thing to note, so the first thing to note is moral isolationists are not claiming that just because you're not a member of a culture, you don't understand it. They're saying that you cannot understand it. Second thing to note is this word judgment, right? Midgley is saying that moral isolationists believe that if you're not a member of a culture, if you're not from there, you can't make judgments about other cultures. This word judgment is used in philosophy different than how it's used in contemporary, language. So oftentimes in English, when we say judgment, we mean things like critique or criticize, right? But that's not what it means in philosophy per se. To form a judgment about something in philosophy is not necessarily to criticize it or to critique it. It can mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. In philosophy, to make a judgment about something, a culture or a person or a practice, is not necessarily to criticize it. It's simply to form an opinion about the culture, the person, the practice. That's all that it means. So to have a judgment, to make a judgment, is just to form an opinion. Yes, just to form a belief, yes, about a person, a practice, or a culture. Okay, this is why I think there's a kind of ambiguity in that word. This is why I think it's funny if any of you have been to Planet Fitness, that gym. I used to work out there. They used to, do you know the slogan? Yeah, I've seen the commercials or something like that, or been there. They have like up on the walls, judgment-free zone. And obviously they mean that in a kind of colloquial, everyday English sense of like, this place is supposed to be free of criticism. Although they're like wildly hypocritical about this. At least when I was there the last time a couple years ago, they were still doing this. They have like pictures of big buff guys in like tank tops and carrying around like gallons of water, and they have a circle with a line through that person, right? So they're judgment-free zone, except for like if you're like whatever, a stereotypical meathead, in which case we will critique you. Like it's on the walls. They even have things called lung alarms, so that like if somebody's grunting or whatever while they're lifting, like doing like stereotypical like meathead weightlifting kind of stuff, they will like blare an alarm and like mock you. So like judgment-free zone, they're like wildly hypocritical about this because they want to critique some people but not other people. But whatever. What I think is funny is to think about their slogan and the kind of and just understand it in a philosophical sense. So like judgment-free zone, they mean don't critique people, which they fail to do. But it's fun to understand that in the philosophical sense. Judgment-free zone, don't form opinions, like don't never make judgments. Like that would be hilarious in a gym if it was like a judgment-free zone in that sense, because then a bunch of people would just be like walking around aimlessly, never making judgments, never forming opinions about what they should be doing. So the person would be like, oh, maybe I should do bench press. Oh no, that would be forming a judgment. I can't do that. Like, oh, maybe I should get on the elliptical. Oh, I can't. Oh, that would be that would be judging. I can't make judgments. I love that. But hopefully that'll highlight what it means for philosophers to make judgments is just to form an opinion. It's just to say, this is good, this is bad, this is what I should do, this is what I should not do. Those are just judgments. So when Midgley uses the word judgment in this essay, she's using it in that sense. So the moral isolationist is saying that if you're not a member of a culture, if you're not from there, you cannot understand that culture, these other cultures, and therefore you cannot make judgments about them. And Midgley is saying that means either good or bad, right? Okay. So Midgley's point, what she actually believes is that we can make judgments about other cultures. It's just hard. She says what's bad is not judgments. We have to make judgments about other cultures and other practices. She says what's bad are uninformed judgments. That's what's bad and should be avoided, right? You just like mouthing off about stuff that you have not taken the trouble to even try to understand. That's a problem. But when you've done the research, maybe if something's very complicated, you go live in a culture, you really try to understand it sympathetically, get inside of the practice yourself and do that kind of research, then can you make judgments about those cultures? Mitchell's like, yeah, we need to make judgments about other cultures because we need to know if those cultural practices are good or bad because cultures are really not so separate from one another. As she points out, like people immigrate, people move, cultures influence one another. So we need to be able to make judgments about what's good or bad in other cultures, in part because sometimes other cultures have stuff to teach us, right? Sometimes we're like, man, we look at another culture and we make judgments about them and they're like, man, you do this? Well, we don't do that. That's a really good idea. Like we should do that ourselves. Like that happens all the time. Cultures are always borrowing from one another and influencing one another. And she's like, that's a good thing. We need to be able to do that, she says. It's in fact, our ability to make judgments about other cultures and to think critically about other cultures, she says, is a way of kind of holding up a mirror to ourselves. Because then we can, in making judgments about other cultures, we are essentially prompted to reflect upon our own culture and to ask ourselves about our own practices, whether they are good or bad, right? So we might see, and this is actually here's something we can learn from another culture. This is what Kongzi says. Confucius, the famous ancient Chinese philosopher, he says basically when you're walking with somebody and somebody's like making an ass of themselves, this is a loose paraphrase, somebody's making an ass of themselves, what you should think to yourself is like, oh man, do I do that myself? Am I like this? This person's like a blowhard. The point is when you're walking with this person, not to be like, oh my goodness, this person is such a jerk. The point is to be like, to examine yourself and be like, are there things in this person's character which are obviously defective? Do I have those in my character, right? Similarly, when you're walking along with somebody and they're very wise and you can like, man, I need to be imitating this person. This person is good. They're gracious. They're kind. They're a person of prudence. I need to be imitating this. This is what Confucius says. Whenever you're walking with somebody, you should be trying to learn from them. Or to critique yourself, as the case may be. And Midgley is trying to say something similar about cultures, right? When we interact with other cultures, what we need to do is that should prompt us to reflect on our own culture. So, all right. So moral isolationists are people who think that if you're not from a culture, if you're not a member of that culture, you cannot understand it and you cannot make judgments about it. So I'm just going to make 2 points about her essay. The first point that I'm going to pull out of this, she makes many more, she makes a lot of points I think that are noteworthy, but hopefully by reading the essay you could pick them up yourself. So I'm just going to highlight 2 things. First, Midgley argues that moral isolationism is not a respectful attitude towards other cultures, and in fact it can't be. So many people she thinks are drawn to moral isolationism because they believe that it's respectful. It's kind of like hands off, you're not from there, you can't get it, so just like chill out, don't make judgments about them. But she says basically that the idea that you can respect something without making judgments about it is incoherent. She says to respect something just is to make a positive judgment about that culture, right? And this to me seems to be fundamentally right. So if you respect somebody or respect a culture, what you're doing is you're making a judgment about their culture and you're making a positive judgment, right? If you say that you think about like sports, if you say that you respect a pitcher's pitching ability, what you're saying is you're making a judgment about their ability to pitch and you're saying it's really, really good, right? In order to be able to make that judgment, you have to first be able to understand what pitching is. You have to be able to understand a lot of different kinds of things. You have to understand the pitcher's role in the context of baseball. You can't respect something that you just don't understand, is what she wants to say, right? So moral isolationists say that if you're not from a culture, you cannot understand it, and therefore you can't make judgments about it. But if you can't understand something, then how could you possibly respect it? If respecting something is when you understand it, make a judgment about it that is positive. If that's what it is to respect something, and that sounds plausible to me, then that means that you cannot respect something that you don't understand, right? For example, if I don't know anything about cricket, maybe some of you do. Not the insects, like the sport. I just don't know anything about the sport, or the insects for that matter. I don't know anything about the sport. So somebody with, was on at a bar or something. By the way, cricket, I think, is the second most popular sport in the world, right? Like, I think behind soccer, or football, as people may say. I think it's just the second one behind soccer. And, like, man, here in America, we just, like, don't even follow it. It's, like, never on TV. But whatever. Say, like, I'm at a bar, like an English pub or something like that, and they have it on the telly. I'm just gonna try to bring up all the English ways of speaking I can. I'm sitting at the an English pub, and the cricket is on, and somebody's like, "Oh, do you respect the bowler's ability to throw the ball and hit the wickets?" I'm like, I don't even know what this person is saying. This is might as well just be gibberish. Like, I can't respect their ability. Like, I don't even know what they're supposed to be doing. Are they supposed to be bowling? Like, are they supposed to hit the wickets? Or are they not supposed to hit the wickets? I don't even know. Are wickets even a thing? I'm not sure. I'm just making words up. So, like, can I respect a player's ability in rugby? Like, rugby, man, I don't know anything about rugby either. Oh, man, just like displaying all kinds of ignorance here. But I don't know anything about cricket, so no, I can't respect any of the player's ability because I don't even know if they're performing their task well or poorly. Like, I don't even know what they're supposed to be doing. Anyway, similarly, if somebody were to hand me a newspaper written in, like, Mandarin Chinese and was like, do you respect this, I don't know, this journalist's ability? I would be like, I don't know. It could be a good journalist. It could be a bad journalist. Like, I can't even read what they've written because I don't read Mandarin Chinese, amongst other things. I don't read lots of languages. Barely read English. Anyway, so yeah, you can't respect what you don't understand. Like, yeah, I like to think about this when I'm, like, walking around in the park or something like that. You ever hear the squirrels just, like, chitter in the in the trees? Just, like, make little noises when they're up in the trees. I think they're pissed at me or something, but they make little noises. I always like to think, man, I have such tremendous respect for squirrel poetry. Yeah, they're little chittering up there, they're little chatterings. They're just spouting off poetry, and it's just so beautiful. Like, that doesn't make any sense to say something like that because I can't understand what they're on about. Like, I can't make judgments about what they're talking about because I can't understand them. In fact, why do I keep looking up like I'm looking at a squirrel? Shouldn't have eaten those mushrooms this morning. Anyway, don't tell my boss. What the hell was I talking about? Oh, right, yeah, squirrels. I don't think the squirrels talk. This total sidebar. I don't think the squirrels talk because I'm pretty sure if they did actually have a language, we could probably figure out what the word is for nut, right? I feel like a lot of their lives revolve around nuts, and we can't even pin down that word. So I'm pretty sure they don't actually talk at all, much less have poetry. But my point is, even if they were talking, I can't understand any bit of it, so I can't respect, squirrel poetry. It doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so moral isolationism. A lot of people are drawn to it because they think it's a respectful attitude, and Midgley's like, nope, not a respectful attitude. You can't respect what you don't understand, and moral isolationism claims that if you're not from a culture, that you can't understand that culture. So therefore, moral isolationism actually would prevent you from having a respectful attitude towards any other culture because you'd have to remain essentially agnostic, to use that word in an expansive way, about whether or not the culture is good or bad. Because if you can't understand it, then you can't make judgments about it. Like, you just literally can't, and so therefore you can't respect it. Cool. And again, Midgley thinks that moral isolationism is bullshit, and so she thinks that we can respect other cultures, and oftentimes we learn about other cultures and we do have respectful attitudes toward them because we realize that they do things well, right? Either something that our culture does well too, that we recognize that they do it well in a similar way, or they might do something very different from our culture, and we recognize that what they're doing is good, and so we admire and respect them. This happens all the time, and cultures interpenetrate and mix, and they borrow from one another, and this is how cultures can improve over time. So this is why she thinks it's important to not be a moral isolationist, because we need to be able to learn from one another. Second and final highlight. It says, Midgley argues that moral isolationists tend, in practice, to undercut their own argument. That's kind of a bad pun, given where we're going with this. But moral isolationists tend to, in practice, undercut their own argument. Okay? All right, so in order to make this point, this is where the title of the essay comes from. She talks about this practice from medieval Japanese culture. Samurais. So the reason why she talks about this practice is because it's a dead practice. Nobody does this anymore, and so it's like been hundreds of years since people have been doing this, and so she thinks that we can talk about this one fairly calmly. Although she does think that the more relevant, salient topics, which we maybe would not be able to think about in a very level-headed way, would be things like female genital cutting. And she's like, that's just like a hot stove. We're not going to touch that. Although this is a philosophy class, so we're welcome to touch that. If that's the kind of thing you want to write your reflection assignment on, that would be a phenomenal topic. So you can look it up. Make sure you look at good sites like from the UN or Amnesty International, sites like that. But female genital cutting is sometimes also called female circumcision or female genital mutilation. Those are obviously polemical labels. People who call it female circumcision are trying to give a kind of positive lean to the practice, where people who call it female genital mutilation obviously are giving a negative tone to the practice. I'm going to just cut it down the middle and say call it female genital cutting. But I encourage you to look it up. It is a practice that's been done with millions of girls in the contemporary world, and so I definitely encourage you to look it up and to learn about that practice. And then the question would be, can we, who do not practice female genital cutting, can we critique that practice? Is that something that we can make judgments about or not? Or do we have to be like, you know what, we're not from that culture, we just don't get it? So worth thinking about, worth doing a reflection assignment on, worth learning about. All right, but what does Midgley say? She talks about this practice from medieval Japan, and she says, back in the day, samurais, swords were incredibly important to them, if you don't know that about samurais. And so in order for when a samurai would get a new sword, trying out one's new sword, title of the essay, when a samurai would get a new sword, they would need to practice. They would need to try out their new sword to make sure that it was up to proper standards. And in order to be up to proper standards, the sword needed to be able to cut a person in half from shoulder to opposing flank in one blow, right? So yeah, so in order for the sword, if you get a new sword from a blacksmith, in order to tell if it's up to standards, it needs to be able to cut a person clean in half in one blow, strong enough, sharp enough to do so. So how are you gonna find that out? If you get a new sword, like you can't try that on watermelons. It's just like not the same thing. So she says apparently what would happen is that samurais would go and hang out by a highway basically and wait for some wayfarer, some peasant to come down the path, and then they would just draw their sword and try to cut the person in half. And so, again, to many of us, this sounds like barbaric, right? This to us nowadays, just like practices, European practices of like burning people at the stake sound absolutely heinous and barbaric to us. But that sounds barbaric to us. But again, if you have a moral isolationist around, then you say, oh my goodness, that's awful. I can't believe they did that. Like, did the peasants consent to it? Which that's really interesting questions, because peasants back then would not, and samurais would not have been thinking in terms of consent. That's a very kind of recent idea. That is us actually kind of in some sense imposing our concepts onto this to a culture that would that concept would be foreign to. And Midgley says, hey, that's actually what you need to do in order to have start a process of dialogue, is you use the concepts that you have, and then you learn that they did not have those concepts, and then you try to have a conversation and navigate a very complex situation. In any case, we tend to be, freaked out by practices like this. But if there's a moral isolationist around, they'll be like, whoa, hey, you're not a member of that culture. You don't understand that culture, so you can't pass judgment on that culture. The thing is, Midgley says, they very, very, very rarely stop there. If they just stop there, that would be one thing. But she says, in practice, they tend not to stop there. What they will say is, whoa, you're not from that culture. You cannot understand that culture. You're not from there, and you can't pass judgment on it. And then they'll proceed to say, but if you were a member of that culture, you would understand that the samurai had a very pivotal role to play in the social hierarchy. Moreover, they did not have this kind of crass individualistic view that we have, and so they thought more collectively as a community rather than us as being asshole individuals, and so on and so on and so on. Right? And what they're doing, what are they doing? What are they doing when they make this kind of argument? What are they doing? They're explaining the practice to you, right? In order to try to get you to change your evaluation, to change your judgment from a negative one to a positive one. Maybe they're successful, maybe they're not in doing that. But the thing is, the very attempt at trying to explain this other culture to you undercuts moral isolationism itself. Because moral isolationism is the claim that if you're not from a culture, you cannot understand it. But what they're trying to do is explain it to you so that you can understand it and therefore change your judgment. But that undercuts moral isolationism itself. Because they're implying that A, they do understand the culture, and B, that if you understood the culture, that you would have a positive judgment. Again, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong about you changing your judgment. But they obviously think that it's possible to understand cultures from the outside without being a member of that culture, right? Again, Midgley thinks moral isolationism is bullshit, and she thinks that it's really, really important that we learn about other cultures that are different than our own, both ones in the past. I mean, think about that. If moral isolationism is true, then we would never be able to understand any cultures in the past, including our own, right? We wouldn't even, we don't really understand, whatever 17th century American culture or 18th century American. 17th century American culture. There wasn't in America then, but anyway, just be colonies. But in any case, we don't really understand even, like our own, whatever culture that you're from. I mean, whatever your roots are, you probably don't understand the historical, practices in the past of your culture. So can we not make judgments about those? To make matters worse, Midgley says, there's lots of things in our own culture, like right now, that I don't even understand, she says. And that's definitely true about me. There's lots of things in current contemporary American culture that I just don't get. Does that, and I'm not part of that, subculture. Does that mean that I can't understand that culture and can't make judgments about it? She's like, no, this is just a wrong way of thinking. This is just a wrong way of thinking. Moral isolationism implies that cultures are really radically separate from one another. And she says they're really not. Cultures are just kind of mishmashed, overlapping, crisscrossing, their subcultures, blah, blah, blah. They're intermeshing with one another all the time. And so this idea that cultures are really separate from one another, and that if you're not from another culture, you can't understand it, she says it's just mistaken. The cultures are always mixing with one another. That's the way that history has been. That's the way that contemporary culture has been. And we need to be able to interact with, learn from other cultures, because that's how we learn and how we grow. We look at other cultures, we make judgments about them. If they, like Confucius says, if you think that the practice is bad, then you avoid it in yourself. If you think the practice is good, then you want to embrace it yourself. And this is how cultures improve over time. All right, so there's Mary Midgley in a nutshell. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you next time.